Welcome to Fully Booked, the bookish podcast where I'll chat about all things book and reading related. Whether you're a new or a pro reader, there's something for everyone to learn. I'm here to help you on your reading journey and find that next great read that will keep you fully booked. Hello readers, and welcome to episode 69 of Fully Booked. I'm your host, Natalie, and today's episode is going to be my May and June wrap-up. I'm pretty excited to talk about all the books that I read with you guys because I feel like my seasonal TBRs in particular were a little bit more fun than last year's, so namely my spring and summer TBRs. There were some books on both of these lists that I really enjoyed getting to pick up. There are also some books that I randomly tried out and ended up enjoying, so I just can't wait to share all of these books with all of you. And I hope wherever you're watching from or listening from today that you're getting blessed with some good summer weather, lots of sun, unless you're on the other side of the equator. I also want to quickly ask before we dive into today's wrap-up, how you guys enjoy consuming your reading wrap-ups. I'm noticing a lot of creators favoring or shifting between monthly, bi-monthly, even seasonal wrap-ups. For myself as a book creator, I definitely am favoring the bi-monthly wrap-ups as of right now. I think they're the most sustainable to create. I did find it a bit of a grind when I was doing the monthly wrap-ups back in the first half of last year. But for those of you, again, listening, watching right now, I want to know what you guys think, because I do understand that monthly wrap-ups are favored also simply because the videos or episodes tend to be shorter. I do realize that the bi-monthly wrap-ups get a little bit long since I am reading the amount that I am. But I also feel like seasonal wrap-ups just feel a little bit too infrequent. So anyways, I just love to get all of your input on that. With that being said, let's actually dive into what I read in May and June. So for May, I did read 9 books total, which is 3 for 3 so far this year, because I think in March, April, and now May, I've completed 9 books. I read all 4 books on my monthly TBR, which FYI, if you're newer to the pod and this is one of the first wrap-ups that you're watching, typically I consider a book completed from my monthly TBR as long as I start it within the month that I put it in, or a couple days late is also still okay. The only times that I count a book not completed from my monthly TBR would be if I start it way after the month is over, or if I end up DNFing the book. I also read 2 books from my spring TBR, and once again we had 0 DNFs. I feel like I'm also on a roll with the DNFs so far for this year. I think I haven't had a DNF since February now, so I'm hoping to keep it that way for the rest of this year, for sure. FYI, for those of you watching right now, if you see the sweater coming on and off throughout the whole rest of this episode, just know that the thermostat in my unit is just completely out of whack, and it has been freezing the past couple weeks, and right now, while I'm starting to film. But anyways, enough of the side notes and talking. Let's actually get into the books that I read in May. So for the first book that I finished in May, I did read Margo's Got Money Troubles by Ruby Thorpe, and I rated this 3.5 stars. I think a lot of you already know the premise of this book, but just to go over it a bit, we follow our FMC Margo, who is 19 years old and in college, and shortly after the start of this story becomes impregnated by her English professor. She decides to go through with the birth and raising this child on her own, but quickly finds she is running out of options in terms of providing for herself and her newborn baby, especially since she kind of gets forced to unenroll from the university that she was attending. In a somewhat desperate attempt, she decides to turn to something a little more unconventional, which is a certain website that goes by initials OF. I think we all know what I'm talking about here. And then the rest of the story is really just her going on this kind of new content creator, quote, journey. She also ends up reuniting with her estranged father, Jinx, who actually ends up helping her on this kind of newfound career journey. I actually did enjoy a lot of aspects of this book. I actually felt the writing style was really cool and interesting, especially because there was a lot of good insight on kind of societal perceptions of, women in Margo's particular situation and how they choose to make a living. And yeah, just kind of all those perceptions and pressures that certain women face, and also kind of the lack of help and resources that there are for them. I thought a lot of that she explored, and especially the very particular emotions and thoughts that Margo was experiencing throughout the story, were very insightful. However, I didn't really love that much else about this story besides that. I did like Margo and Jinx's relationship. I actually thought their father-daughter relationship was very sweet, although albeit a little bit eccentric at times. Otherwise though, I honestly pretty much hated the rest of the characters in this book. And it was just kind of one of those stories where by the end of it, I didn't feel like much had changed externally, which doesn't always have to be the case of these literary fiction stories. I do understand that. I kind of felt like we were almost where we started from the beginning of the book, and most of the change had just been more reflective for Margo. So yeah, I think I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to think or feel by the end of this book, which is not a bad thing, but I don't know, maybe I'm just not used to it still. And I will say, besides some descriptions of certain genital parts and a lot of boobs, this book was actually, again, not super explicit in terms of the spice. The scenes that actually did occur in this book were very faded black, so that was actually a pleasant surprise, again, considering the overall nature of this book. And I'm not really sure who I recommend this book to, because it's a very particular taste. I guess take with that what you will. The next book I picked up, which was a little bit more fun, was Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli, which, by the way, I watched 2 reels where she was introducing herself, and that is how she pronounced it. This is the first in the Crimson Moth Romantasy duology, and I ended up rating this 4.25 stars, and I gave it a 1.25 spice rating. I honestly do agree with a lot of the reviews I heard about this book, where I've heard that it's a great, super easy, fun world and setup to get into, especially great for people who don't read as much fantasy or romantasy like myself. So in this one, we're basically set in a Regency-esque magical world, but we are set in an era in this world where they are trying to hunt down basically every single witch out there. And so our FMC Rune tries to basically get by in society as a socialite by day, but by night she actually works as a witch vigilant known as the Crimson Moth. And she herself is also a witch, so a lot about herself that she's really trying to hide throughout this book. And then enters our MMC Gideon, who is the captain of the Blood Guard and is a major witch hunter in this world. He comes to the conclusion that Rune is either the Crimson Moth or is in league with the Crimson Moth. And so we have this whole cat and mouse vibe going on throughout most of this story where he is trying to uncover the Crimson Moth. Honestly, there was just so much I loved about this world. I definitely loved the Regency era vibes of it. I think it was a lot cooler than if it were to have been set in more modern times. I have to say, I think I was actually more into the plot and the world than I was into the romance. I think I liked the cat and mouse and the anticipation and build-up of the romance, but once we actually got to the parts where they were starting to really realize their feelings for each other and get together, it kind of just went, I don't know, not downhill, but I just wasn't as engaged in that as I was in finding out more about the world, and especially details in the past of certain characters that we were being introduced to. Definitely the way this story ended off was, I would say, a little bit of a cliffhanger, and I'm curious to see what happens in the sequel. Also, while this was not a no spice or closed door romantasy, there was still very little spice, hence the rating that I gave it. The final note I do want to make about this book, which I haven't been having to do this so much so far because I don't pick up a lot of fantasy, but I did want to make a note about the magic system and those elements in this story. While in the past I would have just brushed it off a little, kind of ignored it because it's just a fictional story, I did feel like it was good to talk about this since I am trying to read through more of a Christian lens. Note that the magic system in this book is a blood magic system where they basically either have to use their own blood or the blood of someone else to cast spells. The only reason I think I finished this book was because we didn't get that graphic and descriptive with the blood magic in this book. However, I am being a little bit wary going into the second book because, again, the way this book ended, I'm getting a sense of what could happen in the second book and what we are going to see. And so I'm not sure if we're going to delve into a lot more detail into the magic system. And while I loved this book and I want to know what happens to each of our characters, I do feel that it would be wise to stop if I am feeling convicted that it is not the right read as a Christian. I don't know how many of you watching are going to care, but that's just one more thing to keep in mind. You guys, I did a lot of genre switching, at least in the month of May, because the next book I read was The Good Part by Sophie Cousins. I actually haven't talked about this book a lot on the pod, but it's one that's been on my radar for quite a while. I've seen a lot of other creators I like who have similar tastes to me talking about this book and saying how much they enjoyed it. So I'm glad that I finally got to complete this one. I gave it 4 stars and a 0.75 spice rating, although I would say that this book is more women's or literary fiction, but the romance subplot is fairly important to the storyline. The premise of this is basically what I would call 13 going on 30 meets Big, where we open up on our FMC, Lucy, who is 26 years old. She's still working a very junior role at her TV production company and lives in a tiny flat with her 3 other roommates, and life is just not going how she planned or expected it would at this point. And then one night on her way home, she ends up stumbling upon this wishing machine. She decides to make a wish that she could just skip to the good part of her life. The next morning, she wakes up in a home that she's never seen, to a man she's never met, but is supposedly her husband, and to 2 children who she also doesn't know, but are her children. And then comes to realize that she has somehow skipped ahead 16 years. Again, I enjoyed this story so much. I think this magical realism premise was a very clever one. It allowed us to explore so many interesting concepts, I think, about how the passage of real time matters so much and is tied a lot to memories and the emotions and how we experience things in the different stages of our lives. I actually loved a lot of these scenes where she's just trying to figure out how to do life, just kind of being thrown into the deep end, so to speak. I feel like this story reminded me a lot of Rebecca Searle's books, in particular In 5 Years, which is one that I've also read and enjoyed. I would say though that while Rebecca Searle is more on the reflective and emotional side, Sophie Cousins is kind of more on the reflective but more heartwarming and funny side. There's a lot of experiencing loss when you never even know what you lost. If you can't tell, I loved so many things about this book. It was genuinely real and uplifting. The one thing though I will say is that I didn't know how to feel about the ending, because while I understood what she was trying to do with the ending, what we were supposed to take away as the reader, I felt like plot-wise we kind of undid almost everything that happened throughout this book. So I didn't really understand why she chose to end the book the exact way that she did. If you also like more reflective authors who also use certain magical realism concepts, I think you would enjoy this book as well. I feel like this book actually did redeem this author for me, because I did remember that I read This Time Next Year by her, and I didn't really enjoy that one as much. But since I enjoyed this one so much, I'm definitely curious to pick up the rest of her books. I feel like a lot of them have those kind of 2000 comedy rom-com influences, and I know that Is She Going Out With Him is also supposed to be loosely based on a 2000s rom-com of some sort. So I think I would like to pick up that one, or honestly any of her other books next would just really intrigue me. The next book I read in May was The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And going forward, I'm actually not going to rate classics, because I realized how much I still have to learn and to understand about how classics work as literary pieces. And to put it shortly, this story basically follows our titular character, Dorian Gray, who has his artist friend paint this portrait of him that captures his beauty so well, and one day makes this deal to trade his soul for eternal youth. So he basically is stuck forever in his 20-year-old body. I did really like the different imagery that is presented in this story and the different themes that we explore of beauty, youth, and pleasure versus goodness. I can definitely see why this was a censored novel. I actually don't know which version of the book I read, because I didn't realize how many versions and editions there were. I will say though that the ending was unfortunately predictable for me, because I could tell that this book is definitely meant to be more of a tragedy. However, this book did confirm for me that I do still like the classics, because it scratches a different part of my brain, even if they are a little bit more difficult to read. There's so many great classics for me to continue exploring. I definitely have a bunch on my radar. I'm just excited to keep continuing on this classics journey. For a more lighthearted spring book, I read What Happens in Amsterdam by Rachel Lynn Solomon, which I gave 4 stars and 2.75 spice rating. This is a contemporary adult romance where we follow our FMC Danny as she moves to Amsterdam to start this new job. Within the first couple months of living there, she accidentally ends up biking, literally, into her ex and first love, Wouter, which, by the way, I figured out how to say after reading the audiobook. Unfortunately, in a turn of events, she ends up losing her job. Because she wants to stay in Amsterdam and is not yet ready to return to LA, she decides to enter a marriage of convenience with said first love, Wouter, and he also needs this marriage in order to inherit his family home. This was just one of those contemporary romances that just had the perfect blend of everything in terms of humor, heart. We had the very classic rom-com banter between our two main characters, but we also had a couple deeper things going on and that were explored. In particular, again, this is only the second Rachel Lynn Solomon book that I've picked up, but I do find that she puts some different elements into her character's background, which I kind of enjoy reading about something different in a romance. So for example, in this one, she mentions that Danny is of a Jewish background and she also has some facial discoloration, which she has had her entire life. I enjoyed these different elements because otherwise I do feel like there are very typical FMC and MMC archetypes and stereotypes that get utilized between romance books and does start to feel all a bit the same. The only things I will say about this romance were I wish we understood a little better why these two broke up in the first place, because even by the time I reached the end of the story, I still didn't really understand why, and I felt like it was very vaguely explained, as well as the third act conflict was just way too quickly resolved for my taste as a romance reader. But other than that, I didn't have too many complaints with this book. Again, a little bit on the spicier end, but still bearable, for me at least. Again, because of her different characters, it does make me want to check out the rest of her adult romances. Also, if you really love dogs and books, then you're definitely gonna love this one, for sure. Continuing on my Alice Feeney journey, I picked up I Know Who You Are, which I ended up rating 3.25 stars. This is a classic disappearing spouse plotline where the story opens up on our FMC and actress Amy Sinclair, who one night comes home to find that her husband has just mysteriously disappeared. He's left a bunch of his personal belongings behind and he is just gone. She ends up calling the police. They go through an investigation where a bunch of things from her mysterious past end up coming up and unraveling in the present timeline. All I'm gonna say about this book is that while the plot was more addictive and engaging than the last Alice Feeney I read, which was Sometimes I Lie, the reason that I did not rate this book higher, because I was originally gonna rate this a 3.5 stars. The rating came down simply because this ending was absolutely unhinged. I know I try not to give you guys spoilers, but for this one, I am going to say that if you do not like plots that have to do with sibling relationships, then I would say you should skip this book. Which is interesting because I don't necessarily regret reading it for myself, but I can't lie that my jaw was just absolutely on the floor after I finished this book because, again, the ending was just so crazy and not in a good way. Next, I continued on in the Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon, Volume 2, and likewise to when I reviewed Volume 1, I've decided that I am not going to individually rate each book or volume, but I think once I'm done the series, I will give it a overall series rating, which might be a long ways away because technically the series isn't even completed yet. There's not really much I can tell you guys except that we pick up straight from where Volume 1 left off, continuing on in Emma's daily adventures and mishaps at Lapis Lazuli House. What I will say after having read the first 2 volumes is that while these books are always talked about as Bridgerton-esque books, which is partly true because these books are technically set in the Victorian era, I feel like the vibes are very different, where Bridgerton is romance, drama, lots of ballroom. I feel like these books I would describe more as Victorian slice of life, where we just hear about the smallest details and events of Emma's life. But these books are just so enjoyable because of the way she's able to recount all of these events in such a witty and charming way. Something just about the writing style just really works for me. This one was also more fun since we did have an introduction of a romance subplot where we had a little bit of a love triangle going on between Emma and two of our other male characters. So because of that subplot that was introduced, it actually hooked me into this series and made me want to continue reading on, because I actually wasn't completely convinced after I finished volume 1, but I am now fully convinced to continue this series. Likewise, I then continued on my Chestnut Springs journey and picked up Powerless by Elsie Silver. I gave it 3.25 stars and a 3.5 spice rating. This one follows in a similar fashion to the first 2 books, except that it's technically not a cowboy romance because our MMC is a hockey player, so I guess it's kind of more of a small town sports romance with a friends to lovers trope, which by the way, I was a little disappointed when I started this book, having realized that it was not a true childhood friends to lovers storyline. But anyways, we follow our 2 main characters, Jasper and Sloane. We open up on Sloane getting ready to marry her fiance until she learns a shocking truth, which then prompts her to run out on her wedding day with Jasper, who is her lifelong childhood best friend. But of course, the 2 of them have always had feelings for each other. I think summarizing the plot is really the last of the specifics I have to talk about this book with you guys, because I just don't have that much to say about Elsie Silver's books. I don't know what it was about this one, but I was just really checked out by the time I got to the middle of this book. I was just not buying into their romance and their chemistry, even though I normally love friends to lovers. The third act conflict was just so internal in this one that I could not really understand, as well as this book was even spicier than the first 2 books, and the first 2 books were fairly spicy for me, so that's saying a bit. At this point, I'm just super torn on whether I even want to continue any of Elsie Silver's books, whether it's the rest of the Chestnut Springs series or the Rose Hill series. I can already just tell from the 3 books that I've read that Elsie Silver is just not one of my favorite authors in terms of her writing style, the way she does her romances. You guys already know, I am just almost 100% low spice yearning when it comes to the romances that I typically enjoy. And yeah, these books are just definitely not that. The only reason that I'm still hanging on for now is because, again, my one friend who has completed and loves the Chestnut Springs series, I know that she truly loved the first 4 books, and the only book that she didn't enjoy was the last book, Hopeless. So the optimistic part of me feels like I should give it a chance and continue on, but another part of me knows that there's just so many books and so little time, and there's so many other books I can get to that I would probably enjoy way more. So yeah, I really don't know what to do at this point. The only thing I will say is that while I was originally going to read all these books on my Kindle because they're all on Kindle Unlimited, I think what I'm planning to do instead, if I do continue, is read all of these on audio, because one thing I have been enjoying about this series is the dual narrated audiobooks. For that reason, I would love to continue these books on audio, and maybe it can be something that I pick up way more casually and honestly put on as background noise more. Having said all that, unfortunately, I just would not recommend this romance book to you guys. Then, for one of my highly anticipated spring hopefuls, I finished Pachinko by Minjin Lee. And this was just a long time coming overall in terms of books I wanted to read. In particular, this was just such an important book for me to get to. And I feel like it truly went above and beyond what I was even expecting to get out of this story. And so I think it shouldn't surprise all of you that I did rate this 5 stars. I feel it's hard to describe this book since we have a lot going on, but to try to get into it, this is basically a Korean historical fiction, truly a sweeping, epic generational saga where we follow 4 generations of one Korean family, where the book starts out in Korea, but then we follow the family as they make their way over to Japan during the formal Japanese occupation and beyond. And I mentioned formal because technically, from what I looked up, the Japanese formal occupation technically ended when World War II ended, but it really didn't in reality because of the continued racism and other wrong acts that were committed against the ethnic Koreans in and outside of Japan. As well as, this book takes place over so many decades, where the book starts in 1910 and we go all the way to 1989. And I'm already going to give a disclaimer now that this is going to be a very biased, subjective review. I don't mean to sound like a broken record for those of you who've already been around. Just to reiterate, I am ethnically Korean from both parents' sides. I already knew going in that this was going to be a very important story for me to read, from what my parents and other relatives told me after they finished this book. Some of the origins and history are so similar, partly because my maternal grandmother was born and lived in Japan for some time, which partially mirrors this family's history and story. There were so many things and details being brought up in this book that were just eye-opening for me to read. It also gave me just way deeper and better understanding and empathy towards the older generations and what they must have had to endure in each of these time periods. Again, just so much oppression, prejudice, and even violence that the Korean people experienced during these decades in time. I feel like this family just felt so real to me, even in terms of some of the emotions they were feeling, which each of these different experiences and stages in their life. Like, they truly just felt like real people to me. Some things I wanted to point out that stood out to me about this story were, especially in the later parts of the story, we get a lot of narrative, or rather a shift in narrative, where racism is expressed more blatantly and even violently in the first half of the story, but I feel like as we continued on into the later generations of this family, we see a lot more subtler narratives of how race and culture intersect in identity and the identity struggles that some of our characters face, which I actually feel like were still pretty relatable for people of immigrant parents, even here in North America, and from stories and things that I've heard from friends and other people that I know. Definitely were some things that I could partially relate to, not fully. So I really enjoyed that. And of course, because this book sweeps so many decades, we really go in deep with this particular family and these characters, each of them, and again, their identity, their struggles, and even just the questions that we asked throughout this book, in particular of, am I Japanese? Am I Korean? Do I even have anywhere that I belong, since I was technically born and raised in a country that barely accepts me as a person? So many deeper questions and meanings that were being brought out in this story. The only small criticism that I do have of this book is that it's split into 3 different parts, or 3 books, and I felt like the first 2 books were really well done, such rich detail, and I could really follow along with the characters' arcs and storyline overall. But I feel like, for lack of better words, we kind of lost the plot by the time we got to the 3rd book. Things were just starting to feel disjointed. I feel like we were introducing and following too many side characters who, yes, did matter because of their relationships to the main characters, but I just didn't really understand why we were getting so much detail of their character arcs and storylines when, by that point in the story, I really just wanted to know what was going to happen with the main family and overall storyline, and I just felt like we were introducing a little bit too much by that point in time. Also, I will say, for a book that is a historical fiction with a very specific focus, I felt like there's a lot more spice in this book, which obviously not the same as a romance novel, but the level of it for historical fiction was just surprising. I was not expecting that at all. Some scenes were a little bit awkward to read, obviously because of how well done this story is overall. That didn't deter me from finishing this story. If you guys can't tell from all the things that I talked about with this book, I 100% recommend this to all of you, whether you have a similar background or not. I think it's still, again, an important story, historical fiction that anyone can pick up and enjoy. I'm already so excited because I actually just found out a couple weeks ago that she's finally releasing another new book later this year, which is crazy because it's been almost a decade since Pachinko was published, and this is the first book that she's come out with. So I'm really excited to be able to have something new to pick up by her. Moving into my June stats, I did complete 6 books. I read 3 out of 4 of my monthly TBR, although I am still trying to prioritize getting to The Love of My Afterlife at least by the end of the summer. So I technically could check off that I read all 4 of my monthly TBR still. It's just that I'm not sure when exactly I'll get to it. I just know that I'm going to try to get to it. I read 2 books from my summer TBR, and we had, once again, no DNFs. And I just want to add a note that normally I would have read more, as you guys can tell from the previous month, but I did go on a week-long road trip at the end of June all the way to Washington, D.C., if you guys have seen some of my recent shorts. Washington, D.C. is definitely one of those trips that is just a jam-packed city road trip, especially because there's so many attractions and free museums and things to do in the city. It definitely wasn't one of those relaxing road trips where I'd be reading by the pool or by the beach. So I didn't really have a lot of time to read. I honestly don't regret it because it was nice to just unplug, unwind, spend some quality time with my husband. That was also his first time to Washington, D.C., so it was fun for me to get to go back there with him. And I honestly think I still had a pretty good reading month overall. It was actually my intention to slow down for the summer anyways. If you guys remember, I talked a bit about it in my Summer TBR and Rex episode. I do want to take a little more time to, again, unplug, unwind, a little more time for myself, and not necessarily push myself to read the usual amount. So yeah, I think we did pretty well. And with that, let's actually just start talking about all the books I read in June. So June got off to a good start because I did pick up Dolly All The Time by Annabelle Monaghan. This is her latest romance release, and it is a fake dating meets Pretty Woman romance trope, where we follow our FMC Dolly, who returns to her hometown of Whitfield for the summer with her son, Gus. One day while she's out doing a delivery for her family's business, she ends up running into Stuart Whitfield, who is indeed associated with the town and this highly prestigious family. She literally runs into him on the road with a flat tire, stops to help him, and the two of them end up getting photographed. Instead of coming clean to the media, they decide to play along with it and end up getting into a fake relationship in order to better Stuart's image. Not only for the media, but also for his family, because they kind of perceived him as this all work and no play kind of guy, and that was kind of the reason for his recent humiliating public breakup. I gave this a 4.25 stars and a 1.25 spice rating. While the fake dating trope is the premise of this romance, I feel like, as always with an Annabelle Monaghan book, this ended up being so much more than that. We especially dive into the wounds and woes of being a caretaker. Our FMC Dolly is basically the caretaker of her family, where her brother has this certain medical condition that requires a lot of care and attention. She also ends up helping her father out a lot with things around the house and the family business. And while she doesn't mind being the caretaker, it's something that definitely weighs on her. I loved how she brought out the subtle impacts of this as well, where we see that Dolly always has a lot of trouble asking or accepting help or asking for the things that she really wants. And honestly, that's a subtle aspect that I actually can relate to a bit. I tend to be a bit of the nurturing type, and I still have trouble asking for what I want. That's something I still could work on. So yeah, I just felt a little bit seen with this FMC, and I enjoyed the romance a lot more in this one compared to last year's release, It's a Love Story. I would definitely say if you enjoyed summer romance or Nora Goes Off Script, then I think you will also enjoy this latest release because it's a little bit more women's fiction forward rather than romance forward. And I find I just tend to like these stories a little bit more. Summer Romance is my favorite book of hers so far, if you guys didn't know. But yeah, I just love all of her books so much in general. I'm always going to recommend any of them to you guys. So if you're looking again for a great women's fiction leaning romance, then definitely give this one a try. And with this one being set on Rhode Island, was also just the perfect summer read. Continuing on to one of my actual summer TBR books, I finished I Hope This Finds You Well by Natalie Sue, which is interesting because I think this is one of the first authors I've read that has my name, which is interesting. That doesn't happen that often. This is an office comedy book, also a Canadian written book. I also did not know that before I picked this up. We follow our FMC Jolene after a workplace incident that occurs that forces her into an HR training program. Because of this incident, upper management wants to keep an eye on her, so they end up installing some sort of software or something on her computer to basically monitor her emails. But they somehow accidentally instead give her access to everyone's emails and files across the whole company. And I'm literally talking every single department and person. She can see their inbox, their outgoing, everything. And so she basically uses this as intel after she quickly finds out that the company's not doing super well and layoffs are coming down the pipeline. And yeah, she just uses that information to basically save her role at the company, as well as try to do a bit of damage control after this initial incident. I gave this 3.5 stars, and while I don't think this one necessarily warrants a spice rating, there is a somewhat important romance subplot between our two main characters in this story. But since not that much happens between them in this book, I would definitely say this is basically an adult no spice book. This was an interesting read because I'm not used to picking up straight up comedy books that aren't necessarily rom-coms. I know I said there's a romance subplot in here, but this book is definitely supposed to be somewhat more of a comedy, and I wasn't really expecting the self-deprecating tone that our FMC takes on throughout this entire story. It definitely comes out in the way she describes how she sees herself as well as her relationships or how she relates to others in her life. That just really comes out because not only is her job at the company not going well in the story, but she's also single, lives alone, doesn't really have many friends outside of work. She's just not in the best place in her life overall, and that's just something that is kind of emphasized throughout this whole story. I wasn't expecting the book to feel this heavy. Not that I would say this book is a dark comedy, but again, it has this self-deprecating tone that the story is told through. The reason I did enjoy this book, though, is that I do think Jolene was a character that you feel like you want to be cheering on. You do want to see some redemption for her. I think a lot of us have been in the same place that she's been in, especially in our 20s. So I did want to see her become her best self. I think I just don't really know who this book would be for in the end. I think I would say that if you're looking to dip your toes into lit fic and you're not really sure where to start, or maybe you're more used to reading romances, then this could be a very good start because it's not as heavy, not as much of a character study necessarily as a lot of other literary fiction tends to be. There's still a lot of plot going on in this book. There's also some romance scenes and banter, again, between our two main characters. And so yeah, I guess again, if you want to dip your toes, maybe this could work for you. Otherwise, I'm kind of unsure if I would pick anything else up by this author, just because this is kind of a new genre to me still. This next book, I think a lot of people are going to know my full thoughts and review on it, and that is Just Friends by Haley Pham. This is, of course, her debut contemporary adult romance novel. I think I was pretty hesitant to be one of the first ones to pick it up when this originally released a few months ago now. I kind of wanted to see what other people thought before I picked it up. Of course, there's been a lot of varying controversial opinions even on this book, obviously because Haley is so well known in the online book space and even in general on YouTube. Having said that, I actually was pleasantly surprised at certain things and also not surprised with other things. And so with that, I ended up rating this a 3.75 stars. And this is a very clean, no spice adult romance, which is what she likes in her romance books. So that was pretty much expected. In this story, we open up on our FMC Blair, who has moved back to her hometown of Seabrook in order to help care for her sick great aunt Lottie. While she's back for the summer, she ends up applying for a job at the local coffee shop, which is now run and owned by her estranged childhood best friend and also lover, Declan. So this is a second chance childhood friends to lovers romance. I don't think I even need to go over certain things that much because I think you guys can already pick up that this book has a lot of elements that I personally enjoy. Obviously, I enjoy cleaner romances. I love childhood friends to lovers, second chance. We have dual timeline in this one. And I did truly like the connection and romance between Blair and Declan. I thought it was very sweet. I actually thought we got a perfect blend of moments of seeing them being friends and then turning into something more slowly. What I will say about this book, and where I do agree with some of the reviews that came in, is the writing style of this book was interesting. Now, I will say, I do have a bit of a preference for more flowery writing style. I love books that are very descriptive, but it also felt like because this book has been promoted as a romance, it didn't really fit that genre. I feel like the way she was describing certain things felt very literary fiction, which is not bad, but it just didn't feel really fitting to, this type of romance and the story. There were definitely some moments and scenes, again, writing style that were clunky, word choices that just felt a little bit too much. It's hard for me to find a ton of examples to show you guys, but I think the one thing I remember is that one of the sentences near the very beginning, this book said something about a conglomerate of pedestrians. While I don't mind some of those words, I do find it a little bit jarring when that type of language comes up. It's definitely a bit Ministry of Time-esque, which honestly makes sense because you guys know that's one of Haley's 5-star reads. But at the same time, despite the clunkiness of the writing, I also saw a lot of potential for her because again, because I like romances that lean a little bit more literary, there were certain moments and the way that Blair would describe how she deals with loss and grief and different, things that have happened to her in the past in her life that I just felt really deeply. I'm not gonna lie, it did potentially feel like a Haley self-insert, but it also made the book very, very genuine and relatable, even though again some language and scenes didn't necessarily work. So I think there's a lot of potential, and I'm actually gonna say it now. I know that Haley is probably gonna write another romance, actually, because I've already seen that she's already working on her next novel, but I actually think that one day she could write a pure literary fiction novel because just the way her writing style leans, you can tell it's, again, way more literary than romance forward. And I think if it's just, finessed and refined a little bit more over time, she could be a really, really good author. So for sure, if you like any of the elements that I mentioned, if you're a similar reader to me, if you like maybe more Emily Henry type romances, then I think you could still enjoy this despite, some of the flaws and imperfections that came with it. I'm actually still intrigued and waiting to see what Haley comes out with next because, again, I do see the potential and I think her books could just keep getting better and better. For a perfect seasonal thriller, I then picked up The Last Time I Lied by Riley Sager, and this one is fun because we are set at a girls' summer camp, Camp Nightingale, where our FMC, Emma, gets invited back to the camp as an adult art instructor. But it's really hard for her to go back because 15 years ago when she was there as a camper, 3 of the girls in her cabin end up mysteriously disappearing one night, never to be found. And their disappearance has remained a mystery to this present day. And then, not to give away too much, but history and the past basically starts to repeat itself a bit in the present timeline, so she then kind of tries to solve this mystery and find clues as to what actually happened in the past and what is actually happening in the present timeline as well. I actually found this book hard to rate, which, by the way, I gave this 4 stars. I think it's because I've read so many of Riley Sager's books at this point. I think I only have 1 book left in his backlist, and of course his newest release, which is coming out later this summer. But I had such a hard time because so many of his later books are so well done in terms of the writing style and just little details and elements that he will include throughout the story. I just feel like we just didn't have as much depth and detail on certain elements or things about the characters that I might have liked to see, and we just weren't getting in this one. It was honestly just a very fun thriller overall. I do think we get taken on a very fun journey with all of his books, but in the end, I'm just not sure how much I'm going to remember this one in a couple months. Also, in terms of the ending, the plot just didn't get super twisty, nothing that really surprised me as a reader who's read a lot of thrillers at this point. But overall, still a good thriller. Probably would rate this higher if I had read it before his other works. Still recommend this. It was a perfect summer thriller. I just would say that if you haven't tried Riley Sager yet, I don't think this is the first book that I would recommend by him. So we're already moving on to the last couple books for June since it was a bit of a shorter reading month, starting with Rebel Witch by Kristen Ciccarelli. This is the second and final book in the Crimson Moth duology. Since it's the second book, there's not really much I can say except that it just continues on a couple months following the end of Heartless Hunter. I did end up rating this a 3.75 stars and a 1.25 spice rating, so I think that will already tell you guys that I did not enjoy this one as much as Heartless Hunter. If I had to put it into words, I just feel like we were kind of missing depth overall, where there was a bit more I wanted to know about the world, even just wanting more details on how the magic system worked, which is kind of funny because I did mention that this blood magic system kind of makes me a bit squeamish. Also, potentially conflicts with some of my beliefs around, magic and witchcraft. But at the same time, as a reader, I found myself wanting to still understand the different layers and things of what was going on in the world, and again, with the magic system. I'm also just realizing, after having now finished this duology, that I'm very unsure at this point if romantasy is for me, which is interesting because usually I love a good romance plotline. But yeah, this one just did not really do it for me. And I liked Rune and Gideon a lot as individuals, as characters, but not necessarily as love interests. And I was not invested in their romantic progression at all. It also might have just been the wrong time because unfortunately, once summer and the warmer weather hits, I'm just really not into these types of fantasy stories, even if it is really good. So yeah, a bit of a disappointing read and finale for me overall, but since I did enjoy Heartless Hunter so much, I would still recommend this series, especially if you're more into romantasy, or if you were looking for a romantasy series to get into that's not intimidating, because again, this is only a duology, then I would still recommend this, but I think this one was not entirely for me overall. And unfortunately, guys, we took a downward turn for the end of June because I didn't end up picking up The Someday Garden by Ashley Poston, which I rated 3.75 stars and I gave it a 2 spice rating. This is one that I've talked about multiple times by now on the pod. I was excited to pick it up, to have another fun Ashley Poston summer romance, and this one just did not hit like the rest of her books have for me, which is very disappointing, seeing as Sounds Like Love was one of my favorite books of 2025. I feel like I've talked about it so many times already at this point, but in case you've missed some of my episodes or shorts, in this one, we are set in a small town in Maine on Lilymore Estate, which is basically this huge estate with these giant grounds and garden, and we follow our FMC, Sophie, as she tends to the garden as the head gardener. One day within the garden, she ends up finding this secret garden, which we later find out is known as the Someday Garden. And within the garden, finding this man who has been trapped in there. And the story goes from there, where we try to see her figure out how to basically free this man from this smaller garden. I don't know how many times I've said garden at this rate. We also see her going through this period of grief because we learn very near the beginning of the story, so I don't think this is that much of a spoiler, that her best friend of many years, Harriet, has tragically passed away, and so she's still dealing with the aftermath of this loss and other people in her life who have already just moved on with their lives, and she just feels like she is not able to move on still. One note I do want to add is that I didn't expect for there to be a love triangle trope within this romance plotline, and while it didn't take away from my enjoyment of the overall story and the romance, I don't feel like it really added a lot, so I felt like it was kind of unnecessary. Maybe she could have added something else into the plotline if she was looking to spice it up. But yeah, you guys know, I just don't like love triangles in general, and this one for me was just okay. It was definitely one of those ones where, honestly, it's pretty obvious who she is going to end up with. I guess I could have just gone without it, personally. I don't know what it was about this story. I will say that I'm not super into plants and gardening, so if you're more of a plant mom, you're into that plant life, you might enjoy this story a bit more because there's so many different description elements of plants and growth throughout the story, all interwoven, which I did find those descriptions so beautiful. Ashley Poston is still a very talented writer, and I found some of the descriptions of plants and flowers so lush, and it really added to the setting and overall vibe of this book. It could also have to do with the fact that I happened to pick this book up on my road trip where I was in the middle of a big city and downtown most of my days, so the setting just didn't really fit where I actually was. And it's really unfortunate. I feel like this book kind of gave me the same feelings as a novel love story did, which unfortunately is also one of my least favorite Ashley Poston. Besides the writing style, there just wasn't anything super compelling in this book to me. I did enjoy, likewise to Rebel Witch, our main characters as individuals, but I didn't really find them compelling as love interests to each other, and it wasn't, again, the most compelling romance plotline that I've read for some reason. I don't know why this book just was not working for me. So yeah, very unfortunate because I feel like I've talked about, kind of been hyped up about this book already even before picking it up. Again, if you do enjoy any of the elements that I talked about, again, especially this setting in a garden, all the different plants and flowers. Also, if you're a big word person, I would say that you would still enjoy this book, and I would still recommend you could pick it up. I just don't think this is going to be my favorite Ashley Poston book ever. And that now brings us to the end of this May and June bi-monthly wrap-up. Hope you guys enjoyed watching, hearing about all those different books that I read. And I'd love to hear from you guys either in the comments or via my socials what your favorite book was for May or June. I always love to hear what you guys have been reading these past couple months. As always, rate and review the podcast wherever you are listening, or if you are watching this right now on YouTube and are not yet subscribed, you should go and do that so you can stay notified of every single thing that I upload. Again, all new content, episodes, videos, and shorts all get uploaded on here, and I think I mentioned it briefly already, but I have been trying to up my shorts game within this past year. And so I've been trying to post a lot more shorts, so if you guys want to keep up with any of my content, YouTube is the best place to do so. And it's just the best free way to support Fully Booked, which I always appreciate all of you guys who are here with me. Having said all that, I hope you all have a wonderful day. I hope you're having a great summer so far, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I hope you were able to take away something, and be sure to follow the podcast for more bookish content. Until next time, stay fully booked, and I'll talk to you soon.